And we're going to pick up in chapter 2. And the goal is to get down through verse 10 is the plan. But before we get started, let's start with a word of prayer. Jeremy, do you mind leading us in a word of prayer?
Most loving Father in heaven, so thankful for the day you've given us. Thankful for this opportunity to have come together and read a part of this book. We pray that we'll get out of it clear and not only explain it, but make it relate to it. Father, we ask that you with us.
All right, thank you. All right, so we're here in this first section talking about the superiority of Jesus, particularly over the angels and the law. And we'll see that more as we go forward. But what we saw is that he is superior to angels, and it emphasizes his deity. Now, this second part, we'll talk about the same concept, but it's going to emphasize his humanity. And so we'll look at that as we go forward. But we looked at this really a kind of sweeping picture of the greatness of Jesus and revelation, obviously, that he is giving to us. He's the one that's speaking to us, is what verse 1 began, or verse 2 began with. And he's comparing the angels and Jesus. And then he goes now to chapter 2 and begins making application with this really strong warning for us here in the first 4 verses. And then we'll look at the elements of his humanity in the beginning of that argument, and then Nathan will pick up and probably finish the end of that on Sunday with the rest of the part on the humanity there of Jesus. So this is a section that we're probably familiar with, but there's a lot here. So let's go ahead and let's pick up at verse 1 here. And if somebody would, go ahead and read down through verse 10. Verse 10 depends on, what you look at. Some people put it in this first section, some people put it in the second section, but I think it's a good bridge, so I want to include it. So if somebody would, go ahead and read here verses 1, verse 10 for us. All right, thank you. Write a note real quick. All right, so let's go through our normal process here. And there's really 2 main sections. So we'll look at the first section, but we kind of hit the main parts of that Sunday. But I want us to go ahead and transition to this next section. So what's interesting to you? What stands out as you go through and look at this section? Okay, all right. So specifying that. And it can be words or phrases that jump out to you. Yeah. So neglecting and then drifting away, connecting those ideas. Go ahead, Emily. Yeah. Yeah. We'll talk about Psalm 8 when we get to more of interpretation. What else? Yeah. Yeah. It's a comparison statement. What else? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Considering the whole first chapter was about how he was greater, and then this one is saying, well, it wasn't always that way. For a while, he was below them. He was lower than them. Um, hmm Yeah, this is. I mean, it's just one of those things that what the scripture does is it holds paradoxes together because we think God or man, right? I mean, even Nebuchadnezzar, he said, shall the gods come down and live among us? He kind of parenthetically says, this is what everybody knows, and yet the Bible actually speaks of God becoming a man, which is like, wait, we couldn't have put it into those categories, right? So yeah, it's holding those two truths together, and unsurprisingly, we usually err on one side of those. Is they had a problem with the deity of Jesus, and the problem that we have is with the humanity of Jesus. And so it just kind of goes back and forth with who you're talking to. All right, what else is interesting to you? hmm Yeah, yeah. And that's really the progression, even in the Gospels. Obviously, John is speaking, but Jesus comes with a new message. He's the one that's starting it. It didn't start with the apostles, it didn't start in another place where he picked up some kind of information. It started and originated with him. Well, go ahead. hmm Yeah, and the glory and honor that we often think about is the glory and honor that God has, right? And yet, what he's emphasizing is the glory and honor that man has, and how he's actually taken on both of those elements and then brought it even forward to something greater. What else? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and there's a couple of elements about that. One, God hasn't changed His original plan for humanity, and even though Adam failed in that, Jesus is still the completion of that. And then it's just emphasizing again this point: Jesus was completely and totally human, which is so backward for us. How do you wrap the infinite and then put Him into the finite? And yet, that's the mystery that's being explained. Go ahead. Hmm. Okay. Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that observation. This is when everybody pulls out their smartphone, the Blue Letter Bible, and like, what word is it? You know. Sure. Yeah, well, because Psalm 8 is referring to Genesis 1, and Genesis 1 has it rule. Like it's really clear there. But probably the rule and the crown here makes more sense based off of not only the context of what he's saying we have to do, but on the context of how Jesus obtained his crown. It wasn't just given to him defaulted. It was because of the way he lived his life and because of what he endured that he was crowned. So yeah, so there's going to be elements of that as well. What else? Anything you feel like we're missing? Things you want to add? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, and the passage if you're referring to in chapter 12, looking to Jesus, it's the same concept here in verse 10 when he mentions the founder of their salvation. And we often think about like the founding of a business, right? Or we think the founding of a building or something. But yet the idea here is of a pioneer. It's of someone that has blazed a trail, and he's literally the first one that has gone through and cut the trail. But that's important because he's the pioneer cutting the trail, and we're expected to walk in the trail to obtain the same victory that he has. And the condition is going to be important because that's down there in verse 10. Um, yeah. What else? Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And one of the things that's interesting to me when I was looking at this, when he mentions the word declared by angels was reliable, and he said every transgression or disobedience received a just retribution. Have you ever got this idea in your mind when you're coming to God that whenever he forgave sin, he just kind of like swept it under the rug, or he didn't deal with it, or it wasn't, there wasn't a punishment? That's not what he's talking about there. He said every single transgression and disobedience received a just retribution. There was never one that just kind of slipped out, got away from God, where he could just kind of turn a blind eye. That was never the provision. And again, as we talked about in the past, that's the conundrum of humanity. We go through and we forget the sins that we commit. We just kind of overlook them, don't think it's that serious. God doesn't feel that way. It is every single one of them he's aware of and is going to hold an account. And then the question that's in Scripture is who's going to pay that? Is it, am I going to pay that, or is he going to pay it? That's the conundrum that he's referring to. Okay, what else? Anything else jump out to you? Go ahead. Sure. Hmm. Yeah, this is just for information's sake. A lot of these themes, he's going to pick them up in chapter 11 and 12. So, for example, when he talks about faith, what is faith? Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, right? He's referring to the same idea right here at the very beginning. And even the racing, or the race that we run and following, those kind of elements are still there as well. Um, what else? Anything else you want to add? There's a couple of things I want to mention, but you may catch them. One thing I want to mention is notice the progression here at verse 3. Declare first by the Lord, and it was attested to us by those who heard. So he's not saying that they heard it directly from Jesus' mouth, but they heard it from the ones that heard it from Jesus. Okay, that's through the apostles. Then God is also bearing witness in two different ways. One is the signs, wonders, and miracles that they would have seen, that they heard about, that they could interact with the people that had been healed or whatever the case is. And then there's gifts that are there in that church that is just as much of a verification that God is working among them. And so there's actually two parts there. So when we were in Romans chapter 12, he talks about this giving of the Spirit, the gifts. That is the community. It's saying God has his stamp on it. He's supporting it. He's backing it, and it's through what he's given to the church. The other element, and we'll talk about this more when we get to the interpretation part. But he says in verse 8, it was not to angels that God subjected the world to come, of which we are speaking. Now, we may be wondering, I didn't think we were talking about the world to come throughout this. What are you describing? What are you referring to? And yet, that will be important because he's referring to the first chapter as well as this next section. But then, let's see. I think we've got, yeah. So that's got the main elements. And there's one other thing I wanted to mention, and Nathan mentioned this as well, that there are things that we presently see, right, or presently do not see, that are true realities, things that have already come about. And I didn't realize this until I went through and studied this text again this time, is how much he's referring to this now but not yet part of the kingdom. We talk about this in different places, referred to it in 1 Corinthians 15, but he's saying something has happened, but we don't presently see it. And so we're waiting for him to return and bring that to fulfillment. And so, anyway, just kind of wrap those things together there. All right, so let's talk about interpretation a little bit here. What questions do you have? What are some things that you look at? Maybe you have a question on, or you're not sure like what that means, or something along that idea. Without everybody rushing to verse 5. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, ESV is, it has been testified somewhere. So this is great for anybody that's preaching or teaching a class. If you don't know what the verse is, just say it was testified somewhere, and then just reference it. So I don't know if he forgot the text or if he's actually. I could see him saying this actually in a sense of, I'm going to be ambiguous about it, but you know about this text and you're aware of this text, but maybe you really didn't think about that text as it relates to what's actually happening here. Um, okay. Well, then why didn't he specify it? Okay, so maybe that's the idea. Yeah. What is the place, by the way? What Psalm? Psalm. Okay, so Psalm 8. We're gonna go back there and read it in a minute. Go ahead. What were you gonna say? Hmm. Sure. Right. And I think we've talked about that. And again, this is just one of those things hop up on the soapbox and then knock this down. There's not Old Testament and New Testament, right? In the sense of one's more important than the other one. It's the same story. And when he refers to Psalm 8 and Hebrews 2, he's expecting, A, that you know the Psalms, right? Psalms are going to be a lot of theology, a lot of main concepts. And then that is automatically referring back to Genesis 1. And we've got to know the entire story in order to fully understand what's presently happening. Okay. I guess nobody has any questions on the first part because I explained the two elements there, and we talked about the just retribution. We'll probably come back to that at the end. So let's talk about the. Okay, do you have one? You tell me. um, one, at least what I'm thinking of off the top of my head. Usually, transgression is going beyond the law, and disobedience is not doing something that the law has specifically said. So usually when we think about sins, right, omission and commission, almost always we're like, I didn't do that, right? I didn't commit that. And yet omission is just as important. For example, the situation with the Jew and the Good Samaritan. The Jew and the Levite, they didn't do anything, right? And yet they were just as guilty because of what they did not do. Um, so anyway, that's what I would. That's off the top of my head. So okay, well let's talk about verse 5 since that seems to be the question here. Uh, he says it was not to angels that God subjected the world to come of which we are speaking. Now, what in the world is he referring to? What do y'all think? Okay, so that is important. Let's look at the text that he referred to. So the very first one that he referred to was Psalm 2, okay? And that's about the coming king. But what was going to be his inheritance? You know, we've been talking about what this inheritance is. Somebody look at Psalm 2 and read to me, I think it's the last two verses, like verses 9 and 10, something like that. I guess I've got it right here, but no, it's 8, read 7, 8, and 9. Okay, so the earth and the nations are his inheritance. Okay, and that's obviously referring to all of humanity, but this is specifically referring to the coming king and what was going to be given to him. So that's one of them. The other one that's referred to when he talks about the world is at the end of 1, and that's verses 10 down through verse 12. And he refers to, yes, that he created them, but he also talks about the fact that they are going to perish. He remains. They will wear out like a garment, like a robe, roll them up. Like a garment, they will be changed. So as he speaks about the present world, it's stuck in this level of corruption and sin and destruction. And God is anticipating a time where all of that is going to be rolled up and then changed. Okay? And that's the same idea, Revelation 21 and 22. You know, heaven and earth fled away. And they passed away, and then he looked and saw a new one. Isaiah 65 and 66 have the same concept that the present world is going to pass, but then there's a future world that we're looking forward to. So that's at least the concept of what he's been referring to. Now, there's a couple of interesting elements though that kind of build out of this. Is the present world subject to angels? Is our present world subject to angels? Okay. I mean, subject to angels. In that they are the ones that are ruling right now. Okay, so some say no, some say yes. Okay, has God ever gone off the throne? Okay, no, we know that he never abdicated the throne. Okay, but somebody look at Ephesians 2 verses 1 through 3. Who rules this world? You can look at John 12 as well. Who rules it? Do it. Yeah. Now, Romans 12, the point in John 12 is he says the ruler of this world is being cast out. There's been a change in ownership in a sense. But think about what Deuteronomy 32 talks about. We've talked about this. Remember the spiritual beings discussion we went through, the armor of God, is that he talks about when the nations rejected God, he delivered them over to the host of heaven. That's to the angels. They're the ones that are ruling and running this. You see this same concept in Daniel chapter 12, Ephesians 6. That's explaining the conflict. Yes, God rules, and yet there are spiritual evil powers that are ruling the present world. That's the battle. That's the conflict that is going on. But yet, as he speaks to the future, that's not going to be the case. Okay, go ahead. Sure. Sure. Right. Right. Hmm. Right. Sure. That's not his main point. And you're right. That's not his main point. I'm just asking a question that we need to think about with our present world. Right. Right. Yeah. I agree with you. Yeah. And the reason is Genesis 3, the reason that this whole thing is in the nature and in the situation it is because instead of bowing to God, who do they listen to? Well, and to Satan. He's the serpent and deceived them. So that's the tension, right? That is being brought up, and yet that's all of that's going to be gone. I mean, we know that. I mean, you got plenty of other places, but right. I mean, he's obviously referring to the present world, but he's saying there's something future that he's looking for, right? And what Byron's intention and what he's saying is right. That was never the intention. It was never that the angels would rule the world or there would be sin in the world and all that kind of idea. And so what you have now is an Adam, a true Adam, that actually does what he was supposed to do. That listens to God, obeys him fully, and rules as a result of that. And then now the new humanity that takes part in that world is the ones that do the same thing. Go ahead. Right. It's delegated. Right. Right. Sure. Sure. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Go ahead. Right. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and the goal was always that God ruled and God reigned. And yes, there's delegating and all of that, those elements. And but it's giving a present window into some of the things that are wrong. Like there's an imbalance. There's an unjust ruler in a sense on the throne that God has come in and deposed. And now we're in a decision of what we want to do one way or the other. Well, let's talk about Psalm 8 here. And, this concept of and I think it will help us a little bit. When he says that he left nothing outside of his control, everything is in subjection to him. Um, I mean, how do you add on everything? Right? I mean, that's both heavenly beings, angels, as well as earthly beings. Everything is already in subjection to him. But I like the middle of verse 8. At present, what do we see? Do we see that? Does it look like when you walk out, does it look like Jesus is on the throne and ruling and reigning? Right. All I'm emphasizing is that Jesus, it is in subjection to him now. So, yes, exactly. We're saying the exact same thing. Yeah. I think you're emphasizing one side of it and I'm emphasizing the other. So, but right. Right. Well, the reason that we're having so much trouble distinguishing between humanity and Jesus in this text is because he's making the point that what is true of humanity is true of Jesus. They're going together. And yet now he's come through and obviously secured a victory. He's ruling and reigning. He's inherited the name. He's already successful in all of that. But yet, when we look at the world, and this would be important for the Hebrews, they walk out those doors. It sure doesn't look like Jesus is on the throne, especially whenever the Caesar's going through and saying, "Hey, bow down to me, and you can save your life. You bow down to Jesus, I'm going to kill you." And there's this present kind of distinguishing element between what we presently have and what we do not have. Um, but anyway, go ahead. What were you going to say, Nathan? Right. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. 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 So let's look at how that happened, though, because that's one of the main points that he's making here is about the means. It wasn't just God came down and patted Jesus on the shoulder and said, "Hey, good job, I'll make you king." That's not what he did. There was a means by which that happened. So look here at verse 9. We see him who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor. We love that part. That's Psalm 8. Why? Because of what? Because he suffered. He suffered and died so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. That's why he's so great, is because he was completely human and he was faithful to God even to the point of offering his life. Now think about verse 10 then. For it was fitting that he, for whom are all things, or for whom and by whom all things exist, that's Psalm 8, that's all of these things that we've been talking about, in bringing many sons to glory. So God wants to do what he did with Jesus with many different people. Okay? He's going to make the founder of their salvation. He made him perfect through suffering. So think about, how are we going to receive glory and honor and be made perfect from this text? We'll transition into application. You suffer, you taste death for everyone, right? That's the whole idea. Now, why does this sound familiar? This is exactly what Jesus said. Take up your cross and follow me. Die to yourself. If you lose your life, you gain your life. I mean, all of these same things that he said it, right? And it was verified again. It's been the same message we read in 1 Corinthians, same message in 2 Corinthians, that this is the means to glory. And yet for us, human beings, when we think about glory, we think, I'm going to amass my army. I'm going to build my wealth. I'm going to do a Babylon type thing, a Babel. Build a great tower so that the world knows about my name. That's not how it works. It's through humble service and the willingness to suffer that you'll get there. And again, this is the problem with the Hebrews. They're kind of like, hey, I don't like that suffering thing. Why am I suffering? I'm a Christian. I thought Jesus was on the throne. I'm not really interested in suffering. That's really hard and difficult. And yet he's saying, hold on a second. He's the pioneer. He cut that trail. And if you want to follow him, that's the trail. There's glory. You see the other side of it. You're going to be part of that world to come, but it's not this present world. So that's the that's my application out of it. What else do y'all see? Yeah, yeah, sure. Yeah, this is the irony of this text too. He says that God has spoken to us through his son, but in a sense, now we have silence in our suffering. What does God say about it? What is God going to say about these kind of times where we're suffering and there's difficulty and all of these ideas? Well, the Hebrew writer does show that he has spoken about that. But there's a lot of times where you're describing, well, doesn't look like Jesus is ruling out there. What's going on? And yet he's spoken about it. We just got to read. We've got to know the story. We've got to know the plan. Um, what else? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. What about verse 1? Yeah. We just drift. My best example of this is one time I was on the a lake in Arkansas with my wife, and we were out there. It was one of those old paddle boats. She's floating in the water, and she said to me, "It was like, hey, it's like we haven't even moved or anything." Well, she didn't have a reference of. She hadn't picked out a point and referenced, where all these things were. I had noticed because I was in the boat. I looked right over at the shoreline, and I knew because I had a reference how far we had drifted away. And when you're in the water, when you're in the suffering, when you're in the difficulty, and you're not looking at the referent here, it's easy to just go and just easily drift away and just through neglect, just think, oh, oh, I've heard that before. Preacher's preaching the same message, same Bible. Oh, I read that story before. And yet, what happens? Just easily drift away from it. And so we've got to pay really, really close attention to it. What else? I guess we've got like 15 seconds. So, any other burning questions? Hopefully, it seems like a lot of people are kind of like, "Whoa, I didn't see all of that in there." And so, go back, look at it. If you got questions, feel free to ask. Nathan on Sunday. So and appreciate him with that. So we'll stop right there and we'll continue. Thank you.